Owen Grayson had $42 to his name and a 7-year-old daughter who still believed her father could fix anything. 3 hours earlier, he'd been a warehouse worker. Now he was a thief in the eyes of the only company that had ever paid him on time. He didn't know that the woman in the wheelchair waiting at the abandoned bus stop, the one with no cash and nowhere to go, controlled a logistics empire worth billions. He only knew she looked as lost as he felt. That single decision to stop the car would change everything. If you're watching this, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay until the end, because kindness like this doesn't stay quiet for long. The termination letter sat on the passenger seat like something radioactive, and Owen Grayson kept glancing at it every few seconds as if it might rewrite itself if he stared hard enough. It didn't. The words stayed exactly where Marcus Webb's secretary had printed them. Immediate dismissal pending investigation into missing inventory. 6 years. 6 years of 14-hour shifts, of skipping lunch breaks to hit quota, of covering for guys who called in sick on Mondays after a hard weekend, and it all ended with a security guard named Pete walking him out through the loading dock like he was something dangerous. He sat in the parking lot of Halstead Logistics for 11 minutes before he could make himself turn the key. The accusation made no sense. Not that anyone had bothered to ask whether it made sense. $3 million in medical equipment, ventilator parts, surgical monitors, diagnostic units bound for hospitals across 4 states, had disappeared from Warehouse C over the past 4 months, and somehow the internal audit had landed on his badge number more than anyone else's. Victor Hale, the floor supervisor, had stood there with his arms crossed and his face arranged into something that almost looked like sympathy while he explained that Owen's access logs didn't line up, that there were discrepancies. The corporate wanted answers, and Owen was, regrettably, the answer they'd settled on. "I've never stolen a paperclip in my life," Owen had said, and Hale had just shrugged like the words didn't carry any weight at all. Now he was driving home with $42 in his wallet, no severance, no explanation that would hold up to a single follow-up question, and a daughter who was going to ask him how his day was the second he walked through the door. Lily was 7 years old, and she asked that question every single day, without fail, like clockwork, like she'd read somewhere that it was the polite thing to do. "How was your day, Daddy?" And every day Owen found some version of fine, some version of good, even on the days it wasn't, because that was the job too. That was the part of fatherhood nobody put in a manual. The performance of okayness, repeated daily, for an audience of one small person who deserved better than the truth sometimes. He drove with the windows down because the AC in his Civic had given out in July, and he hadn't had the money to fix it, and the August heat poured into the car along with the smell of asphalt and cut grass from somebody's lawnmower a few blocks over. His hands felt heavy on the wheel. $42. Rent was due in 6 days. Lily needed new sneakers, the ones she had now had a hole forming at the left big toe, and she'd been folding her sock over it every morning like that would solve anything, like she thought he hadn't noticed, like she was trying to protect him from one more thing to worry about. 7 years old and already learning how to carry weight quietly. He hated that for her. He hated that she'd learned it from watching him. He almost didn't see the woman at the bus stop. It was the kind of bus stop nobody used anymore, out past the old textile mill on Route 9, where the borough had decided 3 years back to reroute the line and just never bothered taking down the sign or the bench. Weeds grew up through the cracked concrete. The plexiglass shelter had a long spiderweb crack running corner to corner, and somebody's old graffiti had faded to the point where you couldn't tell what it used to say. Owen had passed it 1,000 times and never once seen a single person standing there because there was no reason to. No bus had stopped at that corner in 3 years. But there was a woman there now, and something about the stillness of her caught his eye even at 40 miles an hour. He slowed without really deciding to. She was sitting in a wheelchair, sleek, expensive-looking, nothing like the clunky rental models he'd seen at the hospital when his mother had her hip surgery. And beside her was a travel case that had clearly seen better days, one wheel hanging at a broken angle, the handle bent. She was wearing a plain gray jacket and dark jeans, nothing flashy, nothing that would have made anyone look twice, except for the wrongness of the whole picture. A woman alone at a bus stop that didn't exist anymore, in 90-degree heat, with a broken suitcase and no bus ever coming. He pulled over before he'd finished thinking it through. "Ma'am?" He leaned across the passenger seat, calling through the open window. "You okay? There's no bus that runs through here anymore. Hasn't for a few years now." She looked up, and he registered 2 things almost simultaneously. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe close to his own age, and she looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than the heat. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid that had started coming undone, strands sticking to her temples with sweat. Her eyes were sharp, though, alert, evaluating him with a quickness that felt out of place for someone who'd apparently been stranded for who knew how long. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled, like she was used to keeping it that way. "My ride was supposed to meet me here 40 minutes ago. He's not answering his phone." "Out here?" Owen glanced around at the empty road, the weeds, the dead mill in the distance with its broken windows catching the afternoon light. "There's nothing out here. You sure this is the right spot?" "I'm sure." Something flickered across her face. Frustration, maybe, or embarrassment, quickly smoothed over. "It's fine. I'll figure it out." Owen knew that tone. He'd used it himself more times than he could count, the tone of someone trying to convince both themselves and everyone around them that the situation was under control, when it very much was not. He put the car in park. "It's going to be dark in a couple hours, and there's nothing out here for miles. No gas station, no diner, nothing. Let me give you a ride somewhere, wherever you need to go." "I don't know you." "No, you don't." He almost smiled at that, because she had a point, and because the bluntness of it was kind of refreshing after a day of corporate doublespeak about discrepancies and pending investigations. "I'm Owen. I just got fired about an hour ago for something I didn't do, so I'm having a worse day than you, probably, and I'd rather spend the next 20 minutes helping somebody than sitting at home staring at the wall. That's the whole pitch. Take it or leave it." She studied him for a long moment, and he let her because he understood that kind of caution. He understood it in his bones. Anybody who'd grown up watching their mother count change at the grocery store register understood exactly what it felt like to be evaluated by someone deciding whether you were safe or whether you were a threat, and he didn't want to rush her past that calculation. Lily had taught him patience he didn't know he had, 4 years of it, ever since her mother left, and it had been just the two of them figuring out the world together. "You don't look like someone who has room for a wheelchair in that car," the woman finally said, nodding at the Civic's back seat, which was, admittedly, full of a booster seat, a couple of folded laundry baskets, and a half-deflated soccer ball that had been rolling around back there for weeks. "I'll make room. Give me a second." He got out and circled around, and only then did he get a clearer look at the chair. The engineering of it was something else. Lightweight carbon frame, smooth wheels, nothing like anything he'd seen before. It folded down with a soft click when she released some kind of latch, and he lifted it into the trunk after clearing out an old gym bag and a case of bottled water. The travel case went in next, the broken wheel scraping against the trunk liner. Then came the harder part, the part he didn't want to mess up by being clumsy or making her feel like a burden. He came back around to the passenger door and crouched slightly, not touching her, just present. "What do you need from me here?" "I don't want to do this wrong." She looked surprised by the question, actually surprised, like it wasn't one people usually thought to ask. "I can transfer myself, just open the door all the way and give me a second." He did, and watched her shift her weight with practiced efficiency, hands braced, the kind of movement that spoke to years of repetition, of having done this exact transfer thousands of times until her body had memorized every angle of it. She settled into the passenger seat and let out a breath that sounded like relief, mixed with something heavier. "Thank you," she said, and then, almost reluctantly, "I'm Evelyn." "Just Evelyn?" "For now?" A faint, tired, almost smile. "Where are you taking me?" "Wherever you need to go. You tell me." She hesitated, and in that hesitation Owen understood something else. She didn't have an answer. Whatever address she'd been planning on, whatever ride had stood her up, the backup plan apparently didn't exist. He decided not to push. "There's a diner about 10 minutes from here, off Route 12. Decent coffee, decent pie, air conditioning that actually works. We can figure out the rest from there." "That work?" "That works." Wait. They drove in silence for a while, the wind from the open windows filling the space where conversation might have gone. Owen kept his eyes on the road but caught glimpses of her in his peripheral vision, the way she held herself very upright, very composed, even now, even stranded and clearly worn down by whatever day she'd had. There was something familiar about that posture, the discipline of someone who'd learned not to let her guard down in front of strangers. He recognized it because he did the same thing, every single day, in front of everyone except Lily. "So," she said eventually, breaking the quiet, "what'd you actually do before you got fired for something you didn't do?" "Warehouse work, logistics, inventory management mostly, keeping track of what comes in, what goes out, making sure orders match shipments." He kept his voice light, but there was an edge under it he couldn't quite smooth away, a Apparently, $3 million in medical equipment walked out the door over the last few months, and somebody decided my badge number was the common thread. I've got a daughter at home who needs new shoes, and I just lost the only income that was buying them. That's a hell of a thing to have happen on the same day you stop for a stranger at a dead bus stop. Yeah, well, he shrugged, eyes on the road. Figured the universe owed me a chance to do one thing right today. She was quiet after that, and when he glanced over, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something thoughtful, something careful, like she was filing the information away for later use rather than just letting it pass through. He didn't think much of it at the time. He had no reason to. The diner was called Frank's, a squat building with a faded red awning and a parking lot that needed repaving, but the bell above the door jingled the same way it had for the past 15 years, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon hit Owen the second they walked in, steady as a heartbeat. He'd been coming here since he was a kid, back when his own father used to bring him after Little League games, and there was something grounding about the familiarity of it now, something he needed more than he wanted to admit. He got Evelyn's chair unfolded and helped situate her at a booth near the window, then slid in across from her. A waitress named Donna, who'd been working the floor at Frank's for as long as Owen could remember, came by with 2 waters and a notepad. "What can I get you to?" Evelyn's eyes moved to the menu, then to Owen, then back to the menu, and something in her face shifted. A brief, almost imperceptible tightening, the look of someone doing quiet math that didn't come out in her favor. "Just water's fine for me, thanks." Donna nodded and moved off, and Owen watched Evelyn for a moment before he said anything. "You haven't eaten today, have you?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She exhaled, and for the first time since he'd pulled over at the bus stop, the controlled composure cracked just slightly, just enough for him to see something rawer underneath. "I don't have any cash on me. My cards are... It's a complicated day. I'll sort it out." Owen didn't say anything right away. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, the leather worn soft at the corners, and counted out 2 20s from the $42 that stood between his daughter's grocery list and an empty refrigerator. He set them on the table between them. "Get whatever you want. Pie's good. The chicken and biscuits are good too." Evelyn stared at the money like it was something foreign, something she didn't have a frame of reference for. "I can't take that. You said yourself you just lost your job." "I did say that." "So why?" "Because $40 isn't going to fix what happened to me today, and it's not going to fix it tomorrow either, but it might fix your next couple hours. That seems like a better use of it." He pushed the bills another inch closer to her. "I'm not trying to make this a thing. Eat something. You look like you're running on fumes." She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes that he couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe, tangled up with something that looked almost like disbelief. Like she'd forgotten this particular kind of decency still existed in the world and was recalibrating in real time. "I'm going to pay you back," she said quietly. "I know that probably sounds like something people say and don't mean, but I will." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm telling you I'm going to." There was a weight to the way she said it, a certainty that didn't match the desperate circumstances she was apparently in, and Owen filed that away without quite knowing what to do with it. He just nodded and signaled Donna back over, and Evelyn ordered the chicken and biscuits, and for the next half hour they ate and talked about nothing important. The heat, the diner's decor that hadn't changed since the Reagan administration, the way Donna seemed to know everybody's order before they said it out loud. It was easy, Owen thought. Easier than it should have been, talking to a stranger he'd picked up off the side of the road on the worst day he'd had in years. There was something in the way Evelyn listened, fully present, asking the kind of follow-up questions that meant she was actually paying attention rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. When he mentioned Lily, just in passing, the way you mention the center of your life without meaning to make a big deal of it, Evelyn's whole expression softened. 7, you said? 7. Stubborn as hell. Smarter than me already, probably. He smiled, the first real smile he'd managed all day. She wants to be a marine biologist. Has wanted to be a marine biologist since she was 4, which is a long time for a kid to stick with one dream, so I figure she might actually mean it. That's a good age for big dreams. Yeah. He turned his water glass slowly on the table, watching the condensation ring it left behind. I just want to be able to give her a shot at it. That's all. I'm not trying to build an empire here. I just want her to have a fair shot. Something shifted in Evelyn's face again, quick and quiet, gone before he could really study it. That's not a small thing to want, she said. Most people don't even manage that much. They sat with that for a moment, the diner humming around them with the low conversation of other tables, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, Donna's laugh carrying from somewhere near the register. Outside, the light had started to shift gold and long, the way August afternoons did right before they gave way to evening. Can I ask you something? Owen said eventually. Depends what it is. Where were you actually trying to get to? Out at that bus stop. Because that road doesn't really lead anywhere except the old mill and about 40 miles of nothing after that. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. When she answered, her voice was careful, measured, like she was choosing each word with more precision than the question really required. I was supposed to meet someone for a ride back into the city. It fell through. It's part of something I'm working on, something complicated. I can't really explain it right now, and I know that sounds evasive, but it's not personal. There's just a lot I can't talk about yet. Fair enough. Owen didn't push. He understood, better than most, that people carried things they weren't ready to set down in front of a stranger, and he wasn't about to demand she hand hers over just because he'd bought her lunch. You need a ride into the city? I can take you if it's not too far. Wouldn't be the craziest thing that's happened today. It's about 40 minutes from here. I've got nowhere else to be. He said it lightly, but there was a truth underneath it that stung a little. He genuinely had nowhere else to be. No job to get to in the morning, no schedule waiting for him except the one built entirely around Lily. Worst case, I get to see the city skyline for free. Best case, you get home safe. Seems like a win either way. Evelyn studied him again with that same evaluating look from the bus stop, except this time there was something warmer underneath it. Something that had shifted in the last hour over chicken and biscuits and a conversation about a 7-year-old's marine biology dreams. All right, she said, but I want your number first. In case anything, in case I need to reach you. For the money. To pay it back. You don't have to, Owen. She said his name like a period at the end of a sentence, firm and final. Give me your number. He did, writing it on a napkin because neither of them had a working pen that wasn't somewhere in the bottom of his glove compartment, and she folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her jacket like it mattered, like it was something worth protecting. The drive into the city was quieter than the drive to the diner had been, both of them a little worn down by the day, the radio playing low between long stretches of comfortable silence. Owen watched the landscape change as they got closer, the strip malls giving way to denser development, then to the first glass towers catching the last of the daylight, then to streets that got progressively wider and cleaner, lined with buildings that looked like they belonged in a different tax bracket entirely than the one Owen had ever occupied. Just up here, Evelyn said as they approached a block lined with office towers, their windows reflecting the orange wash of sunset. You can drop me out of the corner. Owen pulled over where she indicated, in front of a building with a sleek glass facade and a name etched into stone above the entrance that he didn't bother reading. He was tired, and his eyes were starting to do the thing where the words on signs stopped registering as words. He got out and circled around to help with the chair, unfolding it from the trunk and bringing it to her door. Thank you, Evelyn said again, settling into the chair with that same practiced efficiency. For all of it. The ride, the food, the... She paused, glancing up at him with an expression that had gone soft and unguarded in a way it hadn't been all afternoon. For not asking too many questions. People usually ask too many questions. Figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know. Owen shrugged, hands in his pockets. Hope your day gets better from here. It already has. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and there was something in it, gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something that felt almost like recognition, like she'd seen something in him that confirmed a suspicion she'd been carrying since the moment he pulled over at that bus stop. I meant what I said. I'm going to pay you back, Owen, sooner than you think. You really don't have to make that promise. I know. She wheeled herself toward the building entrance, then paused and looked back at him one more time. But I keep my promises. You'll see. He watched her disappear through the glass doors, swallowed up by the lobby's bright interior, and then he got back in his car and sat there for a minute before pulling away, turning the strange, quiet weight of the day over in his mind. He didn't know who she really was. He didn't know why a woman who clearly had money, that wheelchair alone probably cost more than his car, had been sitting at a dead bus stop with no cash and no clear plan. He didn't know why she'd looked at him the way she had, like he'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. He just knew that for $20 and a plate of chicken and biscuits, something had shifted. He couldn't have said what. He just felt it, the way you feel a change in weather before the sky actually does anything about it. A pressure, a stillness, the air gone different somehow. By the time he got home, the sun had dropped below the rooftops and the streetlights were starting to flicker on along his block. His apartment building wasn't much. 3 stories of brick that had seen better decades, a stairwell that always smelled faintly of someone else's dinner, a hallway carpet the color of old coffee. But it was home, and the porch light above his door was the one bright spot on the whole street, because Mrs. Alvarez next door always left it on for him when he worked late. An old habit from years back that she'd never broken, even after his shifts had become more predictable. He climbed the stairs slower than usual, the weight of the day settling into his shoulders now that there was no one left to perform okayness for. Tomorrow, he'd have to call about unemployment. Tomorrow, he'd have to start looking, start the long, grinding process of finding something else, anything else, in a job market that wasn't exactly generous to a man who'd just been fired under a cloud of theft accusations he had no way of disproving on his own. Tomorrow felt like a mountain, but tonight there was a 7-year-old on the other side of his apartment door who was going to ask him how his day was. And he was going to find some version of the truth that didn't put that weight on her small shoulders. He turned the key and pushed the door open, and Lily looked up from the kitchen table where she was sitting with Mrs. Alvarez, the two of them halfway through a card game that had clearly been keeping her occupied since school let out. "Daddy!" She slid off the chair and crossed the room in 3 quick steps, wrapping her arms around his waist the way she always did, like she was checking to make sure he was still real, still there, still hers. "How was your day?" He crouched down to her level, brushing a strand of dark hair away from her face, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the answer that came out wasn't entirely a lie. "It was a strange one, baby girl," he said, "but I think something good might have happened. I'm not sure yet. We'll find out." She tilted her head at him, considering this with the particular seriousness only a 7-year-old could bring to an ambiguous answer, and then she nodded like she'd decided to accept it, and asked if they could finish the card game before dinner, and just like that the day's weight eased back half an inch, enough to breathe through. Owen had no way of knowing, sitting at that kitchen table dealing out cards with his daughter while Mrs. Alvarez excused herself with a knowing smile, that across the city, in a high-rise office still lit up long after the rest of the building had gone dark, a woman named Evelyn Ashbourne was sitting behind a desk that bore her name on a brass plate, staring at a folded napkin with a phone number written on it, making a decision that was going to upend both of their lives completely. He had no way of knowing that the woman he'd given his last $40 to controlled a company with operations spanning 4 continents, employing over 30,000 people, moving billions of dollars in freight and medical supply chains every single year. He had no way of knowing that she'd been at that abandoned bus stop on purpose, dressed down, traveling without an entourage, running her own quiet investigation into a company she could no longer trust from the inside, an investigation that had, that very afternoon, led her closer than she'd expected to a name she recognized from a personnel file. Owen Grayson, Warehouse C, terminated that same morning under suspicion of grand larceny. He had no way of knowing any of it. All he knew as he dealt the next hand of cards and listened to his daughter's laughter fill the small kitchen was that something had shifted today, and that for the first time since Pete the security guard had walked him out through the loading dock with his eyes fixed straight ahead so he wouldn't have to look at the faces of people he'd worked beside for 6 years, Owen Grayson felt something that might, if he let it, grow into hope. Outside, the city had gone fully dark, its windows lighting up one by one like 1,000 small fires being kindled against the night. And somewhere among them, a decision was being made that would, in time, change the shape of everything Owen thought he knew about his life, his daughter's future, and the quiet, unglamorous kindness that had cost him $40 at a diner that smelled like coffee and second chances. The knock came at 7:15 in the morning, 3 sharp raps that didn't sound like Mrs. Alvarez checking in and didn't sound like a delivery either. Owen was at the stove flipping eggs for Lily, still in yesterday's sweatpants, hair doing whatever it wanted because he hadn't bothered with a mirror yet. He turned the burner off and crossed to the window first, some instinct telling him to look before he opened anything, and what he saw through the gap in the blinds stopped him cold. 4 black SUVs parked nose to tail along a curb that usually only saw Mrs. Alvarez's ancient Buick and his own tired Civic. Men in dark suits standing beside 2 of them, not doing anything, just standing, the way people stood when they were waiting for someone else to make the first move. "Daddy, the eggs are going to burn." Hang on a second, baby. His pulse had kicked up without his permission, and his mind ran through a dozen ugly possibilities in the space of 2 seconds. Federal agents finally coming to make the theft accusation official. Repo men for a car that was miraculously paid off. Something to do with Lily's school that he couldn't even imagine. He told Lily to stay in the kitchen and finish her juice, and he went to the door already bracing for the worst version of whatever this was. It wasn't the worst version. It also wasn't anything he could have predicted. Evelyn was sitting in her wheelchair on the small concrete landing outside his door, dressed completely differently than she'd been the day before. A charcoal blazer that fit like it had been built around her specific shoulders, hair pulled back clean and severe. The exhausted, stranded woman from the bus stop, replaced by someone who looked like she belonged on the cover of a business magazine. Behind her stood 2 of the suited men, close but respectful, the kind of distance that said bodyguard rather than friend. Owen. She said his name evenly, watching his face for the reaction she was clearly anticipating. I need about 20 minutes of your time. I know it's early. He looked past her at the SUVs, at the suits, at the whole impossible tableau crowding his narrow little street. What is this? It's me keeping a promise. A faint, almost apologetic smile crossed her face. I told you I'd pay you back sooner than you thought. I meant it. Can I come in? He stepped back without quite deciding to, some part of his brain still trying to reconcile the woman from Frank's diner, the one who'd had no cash, who'd looked at his $40 like it was a small miracle, with the woman in front of him now, who had clearly arrived with an entourage and a transportation budget that probably exceeded his entire annual salary. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, eggs forgotten, eyes wide at the sight of a wheelchair rolling into their apartment, and 2 men in suits stationed outside like sentries. Daddy! Who's that? This is Evelyn, baby. He searched for the word and came up short. She's a friend. Why don't you finish breakfast? I'll be right there. Lily didn't move right away, studying Evelyn with the open, unfiltered curiosity only kids managed without embarrassment, and Evelyn met her gaze and offered a small, genuine smile, the kind that had nothing performative in it. Your eggs are getting cold, Evelyn said gently. I used to hate cold eggs more than almost anything when I was your age. That, for whatever reason, was enough to send Lily padding back to the kitchen table, satisfied, and Owen pulled out 2 chairs from the small dining set wedged into the corner of his living room, gesturing for Evelyn to wherever she'd be comfortable, though she'd already positioned her chair at an angle that worked without needing his help. Okay, he said, sitting across from her, voice low so it wouldn't carry to the kitchen. Talk. My full name is Evelyn Ashbourne. She said it plainly, without ceremony, the way someone says a fact they've had to get used to saying out loud. I'm the CEO of Ashbourne Global Logistics. Owen felt the words land somewhere behind his sternum, a physical weight he hadn't expected. Ashbourne Global Logistics wasn't just a company. It was the company, the parent corporation that owned Halstead Logistics outright, the name stamped on every paycheck stub he'd ever cashed for 6 straight years without ever once seeing it spelled out in full like that, without ever connecting it to a person, let alone a person he'd bought chicken and biscuits for less than 24 hours earlier. He stopped, recalibrated, started again. You own the company that fired me yesterday. I own the parent company, yes. Halstead is one of about 40 subsidiary operations under the Ashbourne umbrella. She watched him absorb that, patient, letting him get there at his own speed. And I need you to understand something important before we go any further. I had no idea who you were when you stopped your car at that bus stop. I didn't know your name was on a termination file sitting on my desk until last night, when I got back to my office and finally had a chance to look at it. How does that even... He shook his head, trying to find the thread of it. Why were you at a dead bus stop in the middle of nowhere with no cash and a broken suitcase? That's not a CEO thing. That's not anything I can make sense of. Evelyn's expression shifted, something more guarded settling over her features, though she didn't look away from him. Because I've spent the last 8 months traveling under a different name, dressed exactly like I was yesterday, going to facilities I own without announcing who I am. No security detail, no warning calls ahead, no executive assistant smoothing the path. She gestured faintly toward her own chair, a small, economical motion. People talk differently around someone they think is nobody than they do around someone they know signs their checks. I needed to hear what was actually happening inside my own company, not the version that gets filtered up through 6 layers of management before it reaches my desk. And what'd you hear? Enough to know that something is very wrong at Halstead, and enough to know it goes deeper than one warehouse. She leaned forward slightly, hands folded in her lap. $3 million in stolen medical equipment doesn't walk out a loading dock by accident, and it doesn't get blamed on one employee by accident either. Somebody needed a name to put on the paperwork, Owen. They needed someone whose firing would look clean, whose record would look bad enough on paper that nobody would ask follow-up questions. I think that's you. I don't think you stole anything. He sat with that for a moment, the absurdity of the last 24 hours pressing in around him. Fired in the morning, stranded stranger by afternoon, billionaire CEO at his kitchen table by the next sunrise. And underneath the absurdity, something sharper, something that felt almost like vindication starting to take root after a day spent choking on an accusation he had no way to fight. You don't know me, he said carefully. You met me yesterday for 2 hours. How do you know I'm not exactly what they say I am? Because of what you did with the $40. That's it? That's your evidence? It's not evidence in a legal sense, no. A faint, dry edge crept into her voice. But I've spent 8 months meeting people who had every opportunity to take advantage of someone they thought was a stranded, vulnerable stranger, and almost every single one of them found some small way to extract value from the situation. Overcharging, lying about prices, disappearing with belongings they offered to hold. You gave me money you very clearly couldn't spare, asked for nothing in return, and didn't even want to know who I really was. That tells me more about a person's character than any background check my legal team could run. She paused. Though, for what it's worth, we did run one. It came back clean. Whatever discrepancies showed up in the warehouse logs, they weren't generated by anything you did. Owen rubbed a hand over his face, trying to keep up with the ground shifting under him. Okay, so what do you want from me? You didn't bring 4 SUVs and 2 bodyguards to my apartment at 7 in the morning just to tell me I'm not a thief. Evelyn's expression sharpened into something more focused, more like the version of her he imagined sat behind a desk making decisions worth millions of dollars. I want to offer you a job, not your old position. Something different, working directly with my internal investigations team. I need someone who actually understands what happens on a warehouse floor, who can read inventory logs and shipment manifests, and tell me when something doesn't add up, who isn't going to get lost in corporate language designed to obscure rather than clarify. I think that's you. I think you've spent 6 years learning exactly how a place like Halstead actually functions, in ways that no executive sitting in a glass office downtown could ever learn. You want me to investigate the same company that just fired me for something I didn't do. I want you to help me prove who actually did it. Her voice had gone quieter, more direct. Victor Hale didn't act alone, Owen. The discrepancies in the inventory logs go back almost 2 years, long before you were even working that floor. Someone above him has been covering for it, and I think it goes higher than I originally suspected. I can't trust my own internal audit team completely because I don't know yet who's protecting whom. I need eyes I can actually rely on. From the kitchen, Lily's voice rang out, asking if she could have more orange juice, and Owen called back that she could, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face, his mind running through the calculus of it, a steady paycheck after the terror of $42 and a due rent payment, the chance to clear his name properly instead of just quietly disappearing into unemployment with an unresolved accusation trailing behind him for the rest of his working life. And underneath both of those things, something else, something that mattered more than he wanted to admit out loud. Justice. Not just for himself, but for whoever else had gotten caught in whatever net Victor Hale had been weaving for 2 years. What's the pay? He asked, because somebody had to be practical, and it clearly wasn't going to be the billionaire. She named a figure that made him sit back slightly in his chair, more than double what he'd been making at the warehouse, plus benefits, plus what she described as a signing arrangement that would cover him for the gap month while the position got formalized through HR. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her, trying to find the catch, the fine print, the part where this stopped being too good to be true. Why me? He said finally, quieter now. Really? There's got to be people with degrees, with investigation experience, who could do this better than I could. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, something had softened in her voice, something less rehearsed than the rest of the conversation had been. Because yesterday you had $42 and a daughter waiting at home, and you still stopped for a stranger you owed nothing to. I've had executives with Ivy League degrees lie to my face about quarterly numbers to protect their bonuses. I don't trust credentials anymore, Owen. I trust what people actually do when nobody's making them do it. He sat with that, the weight of it, and thought about Lily's sock folded over the hole in her sneaker, about the 11 minutes he'd sat frozen in the Halstead parking lot, unable to make himself drive, about the particular flavor of helplessness that came with being accused of something you didn't do and having no real way to prove otherwise. He thought about every other warehouse worker who might be sitting somewhere right now in the same position he'd been in yesterday, fired and confused and broke because somebody higher up the chain needed a name to put on a file. "I want to know everything," he said, "before I say yes. I want to know what you actually know, what you suspect, who you think is involved. I'm not signing up to be somebody's scapegoat a second time." "Fair." Evelyn reached into a slim leather folio one of the men outside had handed her on the way in, and pulled out a tablet, turning it so Owen could see the screen. "This is what we found so far." What followed took the better part of an hour, Lily eventually wandering off to watch cartoons in the next room, while Owen and Evelyn pored over spreadsheets and shipment logs that painted a picture far uglier than a single dishonest supervisor skimming inventory for personal profit. The numbers told a story of systematic theft stretching back nearly 2 years. Medical equipment rerouted through shell logistics companies, shipping manifests altered just enough to slip past routine audits, payments routed through accounts that traced back to offshore entities with names that meant nothing on their own, but when cross-referenced against executive compensation records, started to form an uncomfortable pattern. "Victor Hale's signature is all over the warehouse-level paperwork," Evelyn said, scrolling through a string of authorization forms. "But Victor Hale makes $68,000 a year. He didn't engineer something this sophisticated on his own, and he definitely didn't have the corporate access needed to falsify the higher-level audit trail that should have caught this 18 months ago. Somebody above him made sure those audits came back clean." "Who?" "I don't know yet. That's the problem." She set the tablet down, frustration evident in the tight line of her jaw. "My COO signs off on the quarterly compliance reports personally. Either he's grossly incompetent, which doesn't track with the man I've worked beside for 6 years, or he's involved, which I don't want to believe but can't rule out anymore. There are at least 2 other senior executives whose names keep showing up adjacent to transactions that don't have clean explanations. I can't move against any of them without proof solid enough to survive both a courtroom and a board meeting, because the second I make an accusation I can't fully back, I hand them the leverage to discredit the entire investigation and bury it for good." Owen looked at the spreadsheet again, the careful architecture of theft laid out in rows and columns, and felt something cold settle into his chest. Not fear exactly, but its close cousin, the recognition that he was being asked to step into something with actual teeth. Something that involved people powerful enough to falsify federal compliance reports and frame an innocent warehouse worker without losing a minute of sleep over it. "If I do this," he said slowly, "what happens to Lily if it goes wrong? If these people figure out what we're doing and decide I'm a problem?" It was the question that mattered most, and Evelyn seemed to understand that, her expression losing its corporate edge entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. "I won't lie to you and tell you there's no risk. There's risk. That's why I'm not asking you to do anything publicly right now. This stays internal, quiet, until we have enough to act decisively. You'd have full security coverage, the same level my own team has. Lily's school, your apartment, anywhere you regularly are. All of it gets monitored without her ever needing to know why." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to pretend I can guarantee nothing will ever go wrong. I can promise you that I will not let you walk into this unprotected, and I will not let what happened to you yesterday happen to anyone else, if I can help it." Owen thought about Victor Hale's face yesterday morning, arms crossed, mouth set in that almost sympathetic line, while he delivered news that had nearly knocked the legs out from under Owen's entire life. He thought about every other name that might be sitting in a similar file somewhere, waiting to be sacrificed so somebody in a corner office could keep a bonus they didn't deserve. He thought about the marine biologist his daughter wanted to become, and the kind of world he wanted her growing up believing was possible, one where doing the right thing actually mattered, where kindness wasn't a weakness to be exploited by people who'd learned to read it as an opening. "Okay," he said, "I'm in." Something in Evelyn's posture eased, a tension he hadn't fully registered until it released. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He looked toward the kitchen doorway, where the sound of cartoons drifted faintly from the living room, Lily's quiet laughter carrying with it. "I want my name clean, properly clean, not just quietly dropped because corporate doesn't want a lawsuit. And I want whoever did this to actually answer for it, not just Victor Hale, all of them." "Then we're aligned." Evelyn extended a hand across the small table, and Owen shook it, the gesture feeling more significant than the brief contact should have warranted. I'll have HR finalize the paperwork by end of day. You'll report directly to me, not through the normal management structure. That's intentional, given what we don't yet know about who's compromised. We start tomorrow. She began gathering her things. The meeting apparently concluded with the efficiency of someone who didn't waste motion she didn't need to make. And Owen walked her to the door, past the two suited men who fell into step behind her chair the moment she crossed the threshold. Evelyn. He said her name before she'd gotten more than a few feet down the hallway, and she paused, turning back. Yesterday, at the diner. You said people usually ask too many questions. I didn't ask you anything yesterday because it wasn't my business. But I'm going to ask now, because if we're doing this together, I think I'm allowed to. What happened? To your legs, I mean. If that's not, you don't have to answer. For a moment, he thought he'd overstepped, watched something flicker across her face that looked like old, well-managed pain surfacing briefly before being pushed back down. But she answered anyway, her voice quieter than it had been all morning. Car accident, 5 years ago. I was driving back from a board meeting I didn't want to attend, arguing on the phone with my father about an acquisition he thought I was rushing into, and I ran a red light I should have seen. Her jaw tightened slightly. T-boned by a delivery truck. The driver walked away with a concussion. I didn't walk away at all. Spinal cord injury, L1 vertebra, complete loss of function below that point. They told me I'd never run my company again, that I should focus on adjusting to my new reality, whatever that meant. A faint hard edge of a smile. I ran the company from my hospital bed within 3 weeks. I think that surprised everyone except me. That why you do the disguised visits? The dressed-down clothes, no entourage? Partly. She considered the question with more weight than he expected. After the accident, people started treating me differently. Like the chair made me fragile, made my judgment suspect, made it acceptable to talk around me instead of to me. I got tired of board members directing questions about my own company to my assistant standing behind me, like I'd lost the capacity to answer for myself along with the use of my legs. Going out as nobody, as just a woman in a wheelchair stranded at a bus stop. People show you who they really are when they think you have no power over them. You showed me exactly who you are yesterday, Owen. That's worth more than any resume I could have reviewed. She left after that, the SUVs pulling away from the curb in a tight, practiced formation that drew the attention of half the block, curtains shifting in windows up and down the street, as neighbors tried to make sense of what had just happened outside Owen Grayson's apartment. He stood in his doorway for a long moment after they'd gone, the morning sun fully up now, the street settling back into its ordinary rhythm. Daddy? Lily appeared at his elbow, having abandoned the cartoons at some point during the conversation he hadn't fully tracked. Is that lady going to come back? Yeah, baby. He crouched down, smoothing her hair back from her face, feeling something steadier settle into his chest than had been there in a long time. I think she's going to be around for a while. The weeks that followed moved faster than Owen had expected, the rhythm of his days reshaping itself around an entirely new structure. He reported each morning not to Halstead's loading dock, but to a quiet, unmarked floor of Ashbourne Global's downtown headquarters. A small team of 4, himself, a forensic accountant named Priya Chandra, a former federal investigator named Marcus Reyes, who'd left the bureau 2 years earlier for reasons he didn't discuss, and Evelyn herself, who attended more of the working sessions than Owen would have expected from someone running a company with 30,000 employees. The work was tedious in a way he hadn't anticipated, hours spent cross-referencing shipment manifests against delivery confirmations, flagging discrepancies that individually looked like rounding errors and collectively painted an increasingly damning picture. Owen's contribution turned out to matter more than he'd initially believed it would. 6 years on a warehouse floor had taught him things no accounting degree could replicate, the specific rhythms of how inventory actually moved, the small tells that distinguished an honest clerical mistake from a deliberately falsified record. This one, he said one afternoon, 3 weeks in, sliding a printed manifest across the conference table toward Priya. Look at the timestamp on the outbound scan versus the timestamp on the truck departure log. 11 minutes apart. That's not possible, but Bay 4 to the loading dock is a 90-second walk max, even pushing a full pallet. Priya frowned, pulling the page closer, running her finger down the column of numbers. You're right. That's not a system glitch. That's somebody manually adjusting a timestamp to cover a gap. She looked up at him with something like respect. How many of these have you caught now? 14, Marcus said from the other end of the table, not looking up from his own laptop. Kid's got a better eye for this than half the auditors I worked with at the bureau. Evelyn, seated at the head of the table, said nothing, but Owen caught the small, satisfied look that crossed her face, and something warm moved through him that had nothing to do with the discovery itself. The pattern that emerged over those weeks was worse than any of them had initially feared. Victor Hale had indeed been falsifying warehouse-level records, but the money trail behind the stolen equipment routed up through 2 layers of corporate structure that all converged. Eventually, on names Owen recognized from the org chart Evelyn had shown him that first morning, names attached to titles far above warehouse supervisor, names that belonged to people who sat in glass offices and signed compliance reports, nobody apparently bothered double-checking. "We're close," Evelyn said one evening, the 2 of them alone in the conference room long after Priya and Marcus had gone home, the city lights spreading out below the windows like something out of a different life than the one Owen had been living 3 months earlier. "Close enough that I'm starting to worry about what happens when they realize how close we are." "You think they know?" "I think Victor Hale is nervous, and nervous people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes get noticed by the people they're protecting." She rubbed at her temple, the exhaustion of the last several weeks showing through the composed exterior she usually maintained. "I want this done right, Owen. Not just fast. If we move before we have everything locked down, they'll lawyer up, claim the investigation itself was compromised, and we lose the chance to take down everyone instead of just the easiest target." Owen looked at the spread of documents across the table, the careful architecture of a crime that had cost the company millions and cost honest workers like himself their reputations, and felt something settle into resolve. "Then we don't move yet," he said. "But I'm not going to sit here forever either. Whatever it takes to finish this, I'm in. All the way." Evelyn met his eyes across the table, the late hours stripping away some of the careful distance she usually maintained between them, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence carrying a weight that had nothing to do with stolen medical equipment or falsified shipping manifests. "I believe you," she finally said. "I knew it the day you gave me that $40. I think some part of me has known it ever since." Outside, the city kept moving the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet alliance forming in a conference room 30 floors above the street, unaware that the next phase of the investigation would require something far more dangerous than spreadsheets and shipment logs, would require Owen to walk directly into the path of the people responsible and convince them, against every instinct telling him not to, that he could be bought. The idea came to Owen on a Tuesday morning, somewhere between his 3rd cup of coffee and his 4th pass through a shipping manifest that still didn't add up, and once it lodged itself in his head, he couldn't shake it loose no matter how many times he told himself it was a bad idea. "I want to talk to Hale," he said, dropping the manifest on the conference table hard enough that Priya looked up from her laptop. "Not in some interview room with lawyers watching through glass. I want to run into him somewhere normal and let him think I'm desperate." Marcus set down his coffee slowly, the kind of slow that meant he was already building objections in his head before Owen finished the sentence. "You want to do what exactly?" "He thinks I got fired and I'm broke. That's not even a lie. I am broke, or I was, until Evelyn hired me. He doesn't know about any of this." Owen gestured at the room, the spreadsheets, the whole quiet machinery of the investigation. "If I show up somewhere he frequents and let it slip that I'm hurting for money, that I might be willing to keep quiet about what I saw on that floor for the right price, he panics. People who panic make calls. They reach out to whoever's protecting them. We follow the thread up instead of trying to guess at it from financial records that take 3 weeks to subpoena and probably won't hold up clean anyway." Evelyn, who'd been quiet through most of this, set down her pen with deliberate care. "You're talking about putting yourself directly in front of the person who already tried to frame you once. A person we believe is connected to people capable of falsifying federal compliance documents." "I know what I'm talking about." "I don't think you do. Not entirely." Her voice had gone sharp, the warmth of the last several weeks replaced by something harder, more protective. "If this goes wrong, Owen, it doesn't go wrong in a way we can fix with paperwork. You have a daughter." "I know I have a daughter." The words came out rougher than he intended, and he caught himself softened. "That's exactly why I'm offering. Lily's the reason I want this finished clean, finished completely, not half buried under a settlement that lets 3 more executives quietly resign with their pensions intact, while Hale takes the fall alone. You said it yourself weeks ago. If we move before we have everything, they lawyer up and we lose everyone except the easiest target. I'm giving us a way to get everything." The room went quiet, Priya and Marcus exchanging a glance that suggested they'd both already run the same calculation in their heads and arrived someplace uncomfortable. Evelyn studied Owen for a long moment, her jaw tight, and he watched her work through it. The investigator's instinct that the plan had real merit warring visibly against something more personal that she wasn't bothering to fully hide anymore. "If we do this," she said finally, "and that's still an if, it happens exactly the way Marcus designs it. Wire protocols, extraction plans, check-in intervals, all of it. You don't improvise. You don't go off script because you think you found a better angle in the moment. Am I clear? Clear?" "I mean it, Owen. I know you do." Something passed between them that had nothing to do with the investigation, and he held her gaze long enough that Priya cleared her throat and busied herself with her laptop, giving them a privacy the open conference room didn't really afford. Marcus took over from there, and the next 10 days reshaped themselves around a plan with more moving parts than Owen had anticipated when the idea first hit him over morning coffee. He learned to wear a wire so small it tucked into a shirt button, learned the cadence federal investigators used to keep a target talking without sounding like he was fishing for anything, learned how to let silence do work that questions couldn't. Marcus ran him through scenario after scenario in a windowless room on the building's 40th floor, playing the part of Hale with an unsettling accuracy that came from 2 decades of having sat across from men just like him. "You don't lead," Marcus said, for what felt like the 100th time. "You let him think the idea is his. He offers, you act reluctant, he sweetens it. The second he thinks he's the one in control, he stops being careful. And if he doesn't bite? Then we try something else. But he'll bite." Marcus leaned back, arms crossed. Guys like Hale always think the universe owes them a way out. You're going to walk in there looking exactly like the way out he's been hoping for. He was right. It took less than a week. Owen found Hale at a sports bar off Route 12 that Marcus's surveillance had flagged as a regular Thursday stop, and he made sure to arrive looking the part. 3 days unshaven, the same jacket he'd worn the morning he got fired, a careful unraveling that Evelyn's stylist consultant, of all things, had helped him perfect without ever knowing why. He sat 2 stools down from Hale at the bar and let 20 minutes pass before making eye contact, like the recognition surprised him. "Hale?" He let something bitter creep into his voice, not hard to find since most of it wasn't manufactured at all. "Didn't expect to see you out here." Hale's face did something complicated. Surprise, then wariness, then an attempt at casual that didn't quite land. "Owen, yeah, small world, I guess." "Smaller than you'd think." Owen took a slow pull from his beer, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably, watching Hale's hand tighten slightly around his own glass. "You know I still haven't found anything. 3 months now. Nobody wants to hire a guy with a theft accusation sitting in his file. Doesn't matter that nothing ever got proven. Funny how that works." Look, that wasn't personal. Corporate wanted answers. I had to give them something." "You had to give them me." Owen let real anger surface, easy enough to access given how true it actually was. 6 years, Hale. 6 years I covered shifts for guys, kept my head down, did the job right, and you handed corporate my badge number like I was nothing. You know I didn't take anything." Hale's eyes darted toward the door, toward the other patrons, the particular paranoia of a man checking whether anyone was listening. "I know," he said, quieter now, leaning slightly closer. "I know you didn't." "Then why me?" "Because somebody needed a name, and you were—" Hale stopped himself, jaw working, clearly fighting the instinct to keep talking against whatever instinct told him to shut his mouth entirely. "I was convenient." Owen finished it for him, voice flat. "Yeah, I figured that out eventually." He let another long pause sit between them before adding, almost like an afterthought, "I've got a kid, 7 years old. I've been eating cereal for dinner so she can have something better. You ever think about that, when you picked my name out of a hat?" Something shifted in Hale's face, guilt flickering through the wariness, and Owen recognized it as the opening Marcus had told him to watch for. The moment a guilty man started looking for a way to ease his own conscience that didn't actually require fixing anything. "Look," Hale said, voice dropping further, "I didn't have a choice. You think I wanted to do that to you? They had me cornered too." "They who?" Hale's mouth snapped shut, and Owen could see him recalibrating, deciding he'd said too much, and this was the part Marcus had drilled into him most carefully. Don't push when they pull back. Give them room to come to you instead. "Forget it," Owen said, waving it off, finishing his beer and signaling for the check like he was about to leave. "Doesn't matter anyway. I'm done asking questions nobody wants to answer. I just need to figure out how I'm going to make rent next month." He'd barely gotten off the stool when Hale's hand landed on his arm. light, almost tentative. Wait, sit down a second. Owen sat, careful to keep his expression somewhere between irritation and exhaustion rather than anything that looked like anticipation. What if, Hale said slowly, glancing around the bar again, what if there was a way to make this easier on you? Not like a job, just compensation for what happened. Compensation from who? You? Not me directly. Hale's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper now. There's people who'd rather this whole thing just stayed quiet, who'd rather you didn't go talking to lawyers or reporters or anybody asking questions about what really happened in that warehouse. They'd be willing to make sure you and your kid were taken care of. Real money, Owen, enough that you wouldn't have to worry about rent for a long time. There it was. Owen kept his face carefully neutral, the wire under his shirt button recording every word. Marcus and Evelyn listening from a surveillance van 2 blocks away with an intensity he could practically feel through the static silence of his own racing pulse. How much money are we talking about? I don't know exact numbers. That's not me. There's people above me who handle that part. I just relay. Hale's hand was still on his arm, gripping a little tighter now, desperation showing through. But if you're interested, I can set something up, a meeting, get this resolved quiet, get you paid, get everybody back to their lives. Owen let the silence stretch long enough that Hale started to look nervous, and then he nodded slowly, like a man surrendering to circumstances rather than orchestrating exactly the outcome he'd walked in hoping for. Set it up, he said, but I want it to be worth my while. I've got a kid. I'm not selling my silence cheap. Hale's relief was almost painful to watch, the relief of a desperate man who thought he'd just found his own way out of a hole he'd dug for himself. And Owen felt something cold settle into his stomach at how easy it had been, how readily a man could be led toward his own destruction once guilt and fear had already done most of the work. The meeting Hale arranged took place 11 days later, and it wasn't with Hale at all. 2 men showed up to a private dining room at a steakhouse downtown, both of them introduced only by first names that Marcus's team confirmed afterward were almost certainly fake, though one of them, tall, silver-haired, carrying himself with the particular ease of someone used to rooms arranging themselves around his comfort, Owen recognized from the org chart Evelyn had shown him weeks earlier. Daniel Voss, Chief Operating Officer of Ashbourne Global Logistics, a man whose signature appeared on every quarterly compliance report that should have caught the theft 18 months before it ever did. Mr. Grayson. Voss extended a hand across the table with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this kind of conversation before, who'd learned somewhere along the way that desperate people could be managed the same way difficult contracts were managed, with patience, with the right pressure applied at the right moment. I understand you've had a difficult few months. You could say that. Owen kept his voice carefully bitter, careful exhaustion, the wire recording every syllable. Hale said you could help fix it. Victor exaggerates his own importance sometimes, but in this case he wasn't wrong. Voss poured wine he didn't offer Owen any of, a small power move that Owen recognized and filed away. Let's speak plainly. You were inconvenienced by circumstances that were, frankly, larger than you. I'd like to make that inconvenience worth your while, in exchange for your continued discretion. Discretion about what exactly? Voss smiled, the kind of smile that had probably closed 1,000 boardroom deals and never once felt like warmth. About anything you may have observed during your employment at Warehouse C inventory irregularities, shipping discrepancies, the sort of thing a man in your former position might have noticed without fully understanding the context. I noticed plenty. Owen let an edge creep into his voice, something that sounded like a man finally getting to say what he'd been holding back for months. $3 million doesn't just vanish. And it sure as hell doesn't vanish because of anything I did. I think you know that. I think you've known that the whole time, and you let me take the fall for it because it was cleaner than the alternative. For just a moment, something flickered behind Voss's composed exterior. Not quite alarm, but a recalculation, the look of a man realizing the conversation had more edges than he'd initially accounted for. He recovered quickly. I think, he said carefully, that you're a man who's been through something unfair, and I'd like to make that right with you. $200,000, paid in full, no paper trail, in exchange for your assurance that this matter is closed permanently. You walk away with your daughter's future secured. We all move forward. $200,000. Owen felt the number land somewhere in his chest, The sheer obscenity of it, the casualness with which a man could offer to buy an entire family's silence over the theft of equipment meant for hospitals, for sick people, for patients who'd never know their ventilator parts had been diverted into some offshore account because a handful of executives wanted bonuses they hadn't earned. He thought of Lily's sneaker with the hole worn through at the toe, of the 11 minutes he'd sat paralyzed in the Halstead parking lot, and underneath the careful performance Marcus had trained him to maintain, real anger surged up hot enough that he had to consciously fight it back down. "That's a lot of money to make a problem disappear," he said instead, voice level. "Who else is involved in covering this? Just so I know exactly who I'm agreeing not to talk about." It was a risk, the kind of direct question Marcus had warned him against pushing too hard, but something in the moment told him Voss was comfortable enough, confident enough, in his own control of the situation to answer. "That's not information you need," Voss said, but he said it with a small, telling smile, the kind of smile a man wears when he believes himself untouchable. Suffice to say, there are several of us who'd prefer this stayed contained. Marguerite Holt in finance has been instrumental in keeping the books clean on paper, and Hale, of course, though Hale's usefulness is starting to reach its limit. A flicker of something almost cruel crossed his face. Some people simply aren't built for this kind of pressure. Owen kept his expression neutral with everything he had, the names landing like stones. Daniel Voss, Marguerite Holt, Victor Hale, a chain running from the warehouse floor all the way up to the company's second highest executive, exactly the kind of complete picture Evelyn had spent 3 months trying to assemble through spreadsheets and shipping logs. "All right," he said finally, 200,000, but I want it in 2 payments, not 1. Half now, half in 30 days, and I want my old job offer or something equivalent so it doesn't look strange that I suddenly went quiet." Voss studied him for a moment, something assessing in his gaze, and Owen felt his pulse hammering even as he kept his face perfectly still. Then Voss smiled and extended his hand again. "I think we understand each other, Mr. Grayson." The handshake felt like it lasted an hour, though it couldn't have been more than a few seconds, and Owen left the steakhouse 20 minutes later with his heart still pounding so hard he was sure it must have been audible through the wire. He didn't fully exhale until he was 3 blocks away, in the back of a nondescript van where Marcus pulled the door shut behind him and Evelyn was already there, her face pale and tight with an emotion that looked very much like fear, only now releasing its grip. "You got Voss," she said, voice unsteady in a way he'd never heard from her before. "You got him on tape naming Holt directly." "Oh, and that's—" She stopped, pressed a hand briefly to her mouth, composure cracking just enough for him to see underneath it. "That's everything. That's everything we needed." "There's more," Marcus said grimly, already reviewing the audio on a laptop balanced on his knees. Voss mentioned a final payoff, a meeting to finalize the arrangement. If we can get him on record handing over actual money in exchange for silence about federal-grade theft, that's not just internal corporate fraud anymore. That's conspiracy, obstruction, potentially racketeering charges depending on how deep this goes. "When's the next meeting?" Owen asked, still catching his breath. "He said he'd be in touch about logistics. Probably wants it somewhere private, somewhere he controls." Marcus's expression had gone hard, professional, which means somewhere we need to control instead, without him knowing we do. Evelyn was quiet through this exchange, her eyes fixed on Owen with an intensity that made him distinctly aware of how close their knees were in the cramped space of the van. "You did exactly what we needed," she said finally. "But I need you to hear me say this because I don't think I said it clearly enough before you walked in there. I was terrified. The entire time you were in that room I was terrified, and I don't say that lightly." "I'm okay." He reached over without quite deciding to and took her hand, and she let him, her fingers curling around his with a grip that suggested the fear hadn't fully left her system yet. "We're close. You said it yourself. This is everything. Almost everything." Her voice had steadied, but she didn't let go of his hand. "We still need that final transaction on record. And then we need to move fast before any of them realize what's actually happening." The call from Voss came 4 days later, instructing Owen to meet at a private property an hour outside the city. A stretch of wooded land that, Marcus discovered through a quick property search, was owned by a shell corporation that traced back after 3 layers of digging to Daniel Voss's wife. Secluded, surrounded by forest on all sides, accessible by a single narrow access road. The kind of place a man chose when he wanted privacy, and the kind of place that made Marcus's expression go grim the moment he saw it on the map. That location is a problem, he said, spreading a printout across the conference table while Evelyn studied it with her jaw set tight. No cell coverage for the last 2 miles of that access road. We can't have eyes on Owen in real time without setting up equipment that's going to be hard to hide on a property with that little tree cover near the meeting point. Then we set it up early, Evelyn said. Before the meeting. We scout the property, we plant what we need, and we make sure Owen has a way to signal if something goes wrong that doesn't depend on cell coverage. The planning that followed consumed the better part of 3 days, Marcus running through contingencies with an obsessive thoroughness that Owen found both reassuring and unnerving in equal measure. They settled on a converted command vehicle, disguised as a utility van, parked a half-mile down the access road with directional equipment capable of picking up the wire's signal even without standard cell coverage. Evelyn insisted on being inside it herself, over Marcus's initial objections. I built this investigation, she said, in a tone that closed the conversation before it could really open. I'm not going to sit in my office 30 miles away while Owen walks into the woods to finish it. I'll stay in the vehicle. I won't be anywhere near the actual meeting point, but I'm going to be there. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and humid, low clouds pressing down over the tree line as Owen drove the access road alone, his hands steady on the wheel despite the adrenaline already moving through his system. Marcus's voice came through a tiny earpiece, calm and clipped, walking him through the final checks. Wire's hot, signal's strong, we've got you the whole way in. Voss's car should already be there. He arrived 20 minutes ago, alone, which matches what we expected. Remember, you're not trying to get him to repeat everything he already said. You just need the money to change hands on record. That's the piece that turns this into something a federal prosecutor can't ignore. Copy that, Owen said quietly, and then the trees opened into a small clearing, and Voss's car was there exactly as promised, the man himself standing beside it with a leather case in one hand and an expression of careful, practiced calm. Mr. Grayson, Voss's voice carried easily across the clearing. I appreciate the discretion. Out here, we don't have to worry about prying eyes. Yeah. Owen kept his own voice level, walking forward slowly, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stay alert. Let's get this done. Voss set the case on the hood of his car and opened it, revealing neat stacks of cash that made the whole transaction suddenly, viscerally real, in a way the earlier conversation hadn't quite managed. 100,000 as agreed, the remainder in 30 days contingent on your continued silence. This is for staying quiet about the theft, about Holt cooking the books, about all of it. This is for you moving forward with your life, Mr. Grayson, and forgetting things that don't concern you anymore. Voss's smile had gone thin, impatient now, a man who wanted this finished. I trust we don't need to revisit the specifics again. No, Owen said. I think you've been plenty specific already. It happened fast after that, the trees at the edge of the clearing suddenly alive with movement, federal agents emerging from positions Marcus's team had quietly established hours earlier, Voss's face draining of color as the reality of the trap closed around him with brutal efficiency. Owen stepped back, hands raised slightly, watching a man who'd orchestrated the theft of millions in life-saving medical equipment and the destruction of an innocent man's reputation finally understand, in the space of about 4 seconds, exactly how thoroughly he'd been caught. Daniel Voss, you're under arrest. The lead agent's voice was flat, professional, cutting through the humid morning air like something final. Conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and bribery for starters. We'll have a more complete list by the time we get you processed. Owen stood in the clearing as they led Voss away in handcuffs, the case of cash photographed and bagged as evidence, the whole carefully constructed lie he'd been living for the past several weeks. Finally, completely, collapsing into something real and irreversible. He didn't move until Marcus's voice came through his earpiece again, rougher than usual, something close to relief audible underneath the professional calm. It's done. You got him clean, on tape, money changing hands, the works. This is as good as it gets. He walked back toward the access road on legs that felt strangely unsteady now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, and the utility van was already pulling up to meet him halfway, the side door sliding open before it had even fully stopped. Evelyn was there, and the moment he climbed in, she reached for him without any of the careful professional distance she usually maintained, pulling him into an embrace that felt less like relief and more like something neither of them had quite named yet. You're okay, she said into his shoulder, voice unsteady. You're actually okay. I'm okay. He held on to her, the case shut now on the past several weeks, The danger passed. Something new and unspoken settling into the space between them as the van pulled away from the clearing and back toward the city, toward Lily, toward whatever came next now that the truth had finally, fully, been dragged into the light. The federal agents moved on Marguerite Holt within 6 hours of Voss's arrest, before word could travel through whatever back channels might have warned her. Owen heard about it secondhand, sitting in Evelyn's office the following afternoon while she fielded a call from the lead prosecutor, her face a careful mask of professional composure that didn't quite hide the exhaustion underneath. "They found everything in her home office," she said after hanging up, rubbing at her eyes. "Shell company records, offshore account documentation, a personal ledger she apparently kept tracking what everyone's cut was supposed to be. Either she didn't think anyone would ever look, or she wanted insurance in case Voss tried to leave her holding the bag alone." "And Hale?" "Picked up this morning, already talking, from what the prosecutor's office tells me. Apparently he's decided cooperation is his best option now that Voss and Holt are both in custody and nobody's left to protect." Something flickered across her face, not quite sympathy, but adjacent to it. "He's naming everyone. 2 more names we hadn't even identified yet. A regional logistics director and someone in corporate security who'd been disabling specific camera feeds on shipment nights." Owen sat with that for a moment, the scope of it settling into something he could finally hold in his hands rather than chase through spreadsheets. 2 years, millions of dollars in medical equipment meant for hospitals, for sick people, diverted because a handful of people decided their own enrichment mattered more than ventilator parts reaching the patients who needed them. He thought about every other warehouse worker who might have quietly lost a job over the past 2 years, names buried in personnel files the same way his had been, never getting the chance he'd gotten to clear themselves. How many other people got blamed for this before me? Evelyn's expression tightened. We're still pulling that together. Legal estimates at least 6 other terminations over the past 18 months that followed the same pattern, discrepancies surfacing, an employee's badge number getting flagged, termination within days, no real investigation. We're reaching out to every one of them personally. Reinstatement where they want it, full back pay regardless, and a formal letter clearing their record for anyone applying elsewhere. That's not going to undo what it cost them. No, she agreed quietly. It's not. But it's what we can do, and we're going to do all of it. The next 3 weeks moved with a strange, disjointed energy. The investigation's quiet, careful pace, giving way to something faster and more public as federal prosecutors built their case, and word inevitably started leaking into financial press. Owen watched headlines accumulate on his phone during quiet moments at the office. Ashbourne Global COO, arrested in sweeping fraud investigation, logistics giant. Uncovers multi-year theft ring, CEO. Evelyn Ashbourne's undercover investigation cracks open corporate conspiracy, and felt a strange vertigo every time he saw his own name appear in the 3rd or 4th paragraph, identified as the whistleblower whose cooperation had been instrumental in cracking the case open. Lily found one of the articles on his phone one evening while he was making dinner, scrolling through it with the particular seriousness she brought to anything she didn't fully understand yet. "Daddy, it says you're a hero. It's exaggerating a little, baby. It says you helped catch the bad guys." She looked up at him, eyes wide and proud in a way that hit him somewhere soft and unguarded. "Is that true?" He crouched down to her level, taking the phone gently from her hands. "I helped some people who'd been doing something wrong get caught. Yeah, Evelyn did most of the hard work. I just helped where I could." "You're still a hero." She said it with the absolute finality of a 7-year-old who'd made up her mind, and he didn't argue with her, just pulled her into a hug and let the warmth of that small, certain faith settle something in his chest that the headlines and the legal proceedings hadn't quite managed to touch. The board meeting where the formal restructuring was announced took place on a Thursday morning in late October. The conference room on the 40th floor filled with people Owen recognized now, after months of working in the building, faces that had once been strangers and had slowly become something closer to colleagues. Evelyn sat at the head of the long table, composed and sharp, in a way that reminded Owen of the woman he'd first met that morning at his apartment door. Except something had settled into her since then, some hard edge of grief and exhaustion finally giving way to something that looked more like vindication. Daniel Voss has pleaded guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction charges, with sentencing scheduled for January, she told the assembled board members, her voice carrying easily through the room. Marguerite Holt has agreed to a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation, which has already led to the recovery of approximately $2.1 million in diverted assets. Victor Hale will face reduced charges given his cooperation, though he will not be returning to this company in any capacity, now or in the future. A murmur moved through the room, board members exchanging glances, and one older man near the far end of the table cleared his throat. And the restructuring you mentioned in your memo, you're talking about more than just filling the COO position. I am. Evelyn's gaze swept the table, steady and unflinching. This investigation succeeded because of information and instincts that came from the warehouse floor, not from the executive suite. I think that tells us something important about how disconnected this company's leadership had become from the operations it actually runs. I'm restructuring our internal audit and field operations division to report through a new role, Deputy Director of Field Operations. Someone who understands what actually happens on a loading dock, who can read a shipment manifest and know in their gut when something doesn't add up, and who has already proven under real pressure that they can be trusted with information that powerful people would very much prefer stayed buried. She turned slightly, and Owen felt every eye in the room shift toward him before she'd even said his name. I'm nominating Owen Grayson for that position. The room went quiet in a way that felt loaded, and Owen sat very still, aware suddenly of how out of place he must have looked in that boardroom in his one decent jacket, surrounded by people whose net worth probably ran into 8 figures, being proposed for a role that would put him in direct authority over operations spanning 4 continents. With respect, the older board member said carefully, Mr. Grayson has no formal management experience, no advanced degree. 6 years on a warehouse floor is valuable for what it is, but this is a significant leadership position. You're right that he doesn't have a business degree, Evelyn said, unbothered. He also doesn't have the instinct to falsify a compliance report to protect his own bonus, which is more than I can say for the last person who held a senior position in this company's operational leadership. I'd rather have integrity I can verify than credentials I apparently can't. A pause, her eyes briefly meeting Owen's. And for what it's worth, over the past 4 months, Mr. Grayson has identified more falsified records, caught more discrepancies, and shown better judgment under direct physical risk than anyone else on this team, myself included. I'm not asking the board to take this on faith. I'm asking you to look at the results. The vote, when it came, passed with only the one dissenting voice, and afterward, as the board members filed out and the room slowly emptied, Owen sat for a long moment in his chair, trying to absorb the shape of what had just happened to his life in the span of about 90 seconds. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly, once it was just the 2 of them left in the room. I didn't do it as a favor. Evelyn wheeled herself closer, stopping beside his chair. I did it because it was the right call, and because I'm tired of pretending the people running this company from glass offices understand it better than the people who actually built it with their hands every single day. You earned this, Owen. Don't shrink it down to something smaller than it is. He didn't entirely know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, just reached over and took her hand the way he had in the back of that van weeks earlier, and she let him, the gesture comfortable now, in a way it hadn't quite been before. 2 people who'd been through something together that had reshaped the shorthand of how they understood each other. The reinstatement process for the other wrongfully terminated employees took longer than the leadership restructuring, partly because some of them had moved on to other jobs, other cities, and tracking each one down required a level of careful outreach that Evelyn insisted on handling personally rather than delegating to HR. Owen sat in on several of those calls, listening to her apologize directly, explain what had happened, offer reinstatement or settlement or whatever each person actually needed rather than what looked best on paper. One call stuck with him longer than the others. A woman named Renata Cruz, fired 8 months before Owen, who'd been unable to find steady work since and was 3 months behind on her mortgage when Evelyn's call came through. Owen watched Evelyn's face as she listened to Renata's voice break on the other end of the speakerphone, watched her quietly instruct her assistant to expedite the back pay settlement before the call had even finished, watched something genuinely moved across her features that had nothing to do with corporate liability management. You didn't have to push that one through so fast, he said afterward. She's 3 months behind on her mortgage because of something my company did to her. Evelyn's voice had an edge to it that Owen recognized as anger directed inward, at herself, at the version of leadership that had allowed this to happen under her own roof without her noticing for 2 years. I'm not going to make her wait for due process to catch up to basic decency. It was a sentiment that ran through everything Evelyn did over those weeks, a kind of fierce, almost personal accountability that Owen hadn't expected from someone running a company of that size. And it was somewhere in the middle of watching her work, Late nights reviewing settlement terms, early mornings on calls with prosecutors, the careful, exhausting labor of trying to make a wrong thing right one case at a time, that he started to understand the shape of what he felt for her had stopped being simple gratitude a while back, had become something he didn't entirely know how to name yet. Lily got her new boots on a Saturday in November, the kind of ordinary errand that would have been impossible 4 months earlier and now happened without any fanfare at all. Just Owen and his daughter at a shoe store near their apartment, Lily trying on 3 different pairs before settling on a sturdy pair of brown hiking boots she insisted she needed for important scientific expeditions, which, given her marine biology ambitions, Owen supposed was technically accurate. "These ones," she announced, stomping her feet experimentally on the store's carpet. "These are the ones." "You sure? We can get the other pair too if you want options." "Daddy, I don't need 2 pairs of boots. These are perfect." She looked up at him with the particular clarity kids sometimes had, cutting straight through to something he hadn't quite said out loud. "You don't have to buy me everything just because we have money now. I liked you the same when we didn't." He crouched down in front of her, something tightening in his throat that he hadn't expected from a conversation about footwear. "I know you did, baby. I just want you to have things you need. That's different from buying you everything." "Okay?" She considered this with her usual seriousness, then grinned, the moment passing as easily as it had arrived. "Can we get the boots and ice cream?" "We can get the boots and ice cream." They walked out of the store with a shoebox under Owen's arm and Lily's hand in his, and he found himself thinking, not for the first time, about how close he'd come to a version of this fall where none of it happened, where he never stopped his car at that dead bus stop, where Evelyn found some other ride, where the investigation never started, and Victor Hale's theft ring kept quietly bleeding the company for years, while innocent people kept losing jobs they didn't deserve to lose. The randomness of it unsettled him sometimes, late at night, the thin thread of chance that had connected a stranded stranger to a man with $42 in his wallet and a daughter who needed shoes. Evelyn called that evening while Lily ate her ice cream at the kitchen table, legs swinging happily under her chair, and Owen stepped into the hallway to take the call, something he'd started doing without quite admitting to himself why he wanted those conversations more private. "How'd the boot shopping go?" "She picked hiking boots. Apparently they're for scientific expeditions." He smiled, leaning against the wall. "How was your day?" "Long. Sentencing recommendations, more reinstatement calls, a board member who still thinks promoting you was reckless and wanted to tell me so again at length." She sighed, and he could hear the tiredness in it, deeper than usual. "I keep thinking about how none of this happens if you don't stop your car that day." I think about that too." "I don't think I ever properly thanked you for it. For stopping. For not asking questions you didn't need to ask. For the $40. Her voice had gone quieter, more careful than her usual business-like cadence. "I'd built this whole structure around myself after the accident, Owen. Keep people at a professional distance. Never let anyone close enough to see past the chair, the company, all of it. You didn't know any of that mattered. You just saw someone who needed help and helped. You don't have to thank me again. You've thanked me about 6 different ways already. The job, Lily's boots, basically my entire life got rebuilt because you decided to." "That's not what I mean." She paused, and he could hear something underneath the pause, some hesitation she was working through. "I mean, I haven't let anyone see past the professional version of myself in 5 years. And somehow you did, in about 20 minutes at a diner, without even trying." Owen didn't say anything right away, the hallway quiet except for the faint sound of Lily humming to herself in the kitchen, something warm and complicated settling into his chest. "I wasn't trying to see past anything," he said, finally. "I just saw you. That's all it was." "I know." Her voice had gone soft in a way he hadn't heard from her before, none of the boardroom steel in it at all. "That's exactly why it mattered." They didn't say anything else of consequence that night, the conversation drifting into easier territory before they hung up. But something had shifted in it, some door cracked open that neither of them had quite walked through yet, and Owen found himself standing in the hallway a long moment after the call ended, turning the weight of it over in his mind. The formal sentencing hearings stretched into December, Daniel Voss receiving 11 years on the combined fraud and obstruction charges, Marguerite Holt's cooperation earning her a reduced 4-year sentence, Victor Hale's similar cooperation bringing his own sentence down to 18 months with the possibility of early release. Owen sat in the courtroom for the final hearing, watching Voss let out in handcuffs one last time, and felt none of the satisfaction he'd expected, just a kind of tired relief that the whole long process had finally reached its end. "You okay?" Evelyn asked afterward, the two of them sitting in her car outside the courthouse, while her driver waited a respectful distance away. Yeah. He looked out the window at the gray December sky, the courthouse steps emptying of reporters and lawyers and the small cluster of other wrongfully terminated employees who'd come to watch the proceedings reach their conclusion. I thought I'd feel more than this. Like there'd be some big moment where it all clicked into place and felt finished. It rarely works that way. The big moment was the clearing in the woods, probably, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. This part's just paperwork catching up to what already happened. She studied him for a moment. How's the new role treating you? 3 weeks in now. Good. Different. I keep waiting for someone to tell me I don't actually belong in those meetings, but it hasn't happened yet. He smiled slightly. I had a regional manager out in Ohio call me yesterday, all worked up about a shipment discrepancy he thought was nothing. Turned out to be exactly the kind of thing we should have caught with hail 2 years ago. Felt good. Felt like the job's actually doing something. It is doing something. The whole culture's shifting, slowly. People are starting to believe that reporting a problem won't get them fired for noticing it. She reached over and rested her hand briefly on his arm. The gesture simple, comfortable. That's because of you as much as anyone. The company's annual employee gathering that December looked nothing like the corporate holiday parties Owen had imagined when he pictured a company of Ashbourne Global's size. Instead of some sterile ballroom event for executives only, Evelyn had insisted on opening it to every level of staff, warehouse workers, and accountants, and IT support and senior leadership all crowded into the same large conference space. Name tags and casual conversation cutting across whatever hierarchy usually separated them. Owen found himself talking to 2 warehouse workers from a different facility entirely, both of them thanking him with an earnestness that still caught him off guard sometimes, for cracking open an investigation that had quietly improved conditions across every Ashbourne facility, not just Halstead. My supervisor actually listens now when somebody flags something, one of them told him, a woman named Denise who'd been with the company 11 years. Used to be you'd report a problem, and it'd just disappear into nothing. Now there's actual follow-through. That matters more than people probably tell you. Across the room, Owen caught sight of Evelyn near the center of the gathering, laughing at something a young IT employee had said, completely at ease in a way that felt different from the careful, composed CEO he'd first met at his apartment door months earlier. She caught his eye across the crowd and held it for a moment, something warm passing between them even from that distance, and he found himself excusing himself from the conversation and making his way over. Having a good time? She asked as he approached. Better than I expected. Didn't think I'd ever be at a company party actually enjoying myself. Low bar given the last company party you would have attended was probably mandatory and miserable. She smiled, and it reached all the way to her eyes, in a way that had become more frequent over the past month, the exhaustion of the investigation finally giving way to something lighter. I wanted to ask you something, actually, and I keep finding reasons to put it off, so I'm just going to ask it now before I lose my nerve. That's not usually how you operate. You're the most decisive person I've ever met. Apparently not about everything. She took a breath, and for a moment the confident CEO, who'd run boardrooms full of skeptical executives, looked genuinely, almost endearingly nervous. Lily's school holiday party is next week. She mentioned it to me on the phone last weekend, completely unprompted, and asked if I was coming. I told her I'd check with you first. Owen felt something warm move through him at the image of his daughter, on her own initiative, inviting Evelyn to a school event without his knowledge. She asked you herself? She did. Very seriously, like she'd been planning the invitation for a while. Evelyn's smile turned softer. I didn't want to assume anything, given everything else going on, but I wanted to be there, if that's something you want too. He looked at her for a long moment, the easy warmth of the room around them, the particular trust his daughter had placed in this woman without anyone telling her to, the strange and improbable thread that had connected a $40 act of kindness to everything that had unfolded since. I want that, he said. I think we both do. She reached for his hand right there in the middle of the crowded conference room, in front of board members and warehouse workers and everyone in between, and he let her take it, no longer particularly concerned with who might be watching or what they might make of it. Outside the windows, the city had gone dark and bright with December lights. The year finally, quietly, turning towards something neither of them had expected to find at the bottom of a falsely accused man's worst morning, but had found anyway, sitting at a dead bus stop with $40 and a willingness to stop the car. Lily's school holidays party turned out to be the first time Owen watched Evelyn navigate a room that had nothing to do with boardrooms or federal prosecutors, and something about seeing her there, surrounded by paper snowflakes taped to cinderblock walls, and a table of cupcakes some overworked PTA mom had clearly stayed up half the night decorating, recalibrated something in him he hadn't known needed recalibrating. She wheeled herself between folding tables with the same careful attention she brought to a quarterly earnings call, crouching her chair as low as it would go to talk to Lily's classmates at their level, asking a shy kid named Marcus about the dinosaur drawing taped to his cubby like it was the most important briefing of her week. "She's really good with them," Lily's teacher said quietly to Owen, watching from a few feet away. "Most adults talk down to 7-year-olds without realizing it. She doesn't do that." "No," Owen agreed, watching Evelyn laugh at something Lily was explaining with her hands, some elaborate theory about why octopi were smarter than dogs. "She doesn't." That winter folded into spring the way ordinary time does when life finally stops being a crisis and becomes, instead, just life, full of small, unremarkable days that mattered more than the dramatic ones in the end. Owen settled into the rhythm of his new role, learning the particular language of board meetings and budget reviews while never quite losing the instincts that had gotten him there in the first place. He kept a standing rule that any frontline worker could request a direct meeting with him. No manager approval required, no bureaucratic filtering, and he made sure that rule actually meant something by showing up to those meetings himself instead of delegating them away. Evelyn, for her part, kept rebuilding the company from the inside out, slow, deliberate work that didn't make headlines the way Voss's arrest had, but mattered more in the long run. New compliance structures that didn't rely on a single executive's signature. An anonymous reporting line that actually got monitored instead of ignored. Quarterly town halls where any employee could ask her anything directly. No script, no PR handler standing nearby to redirect uncomfortable questions. She told Owen once, late on a Tuesday evening with takeout containers spread across her kitchen table, that the accident that had taken the use of her legs had also, in its own strange way, given her this. The company she'd inherited from her father had been built on hierarchy and distance, and rebuilding her own life from a hospital bed had taught her that distance was a luxury that eventually cost you the truth. "I spent the first year after the accident furious," she admitted, picking at a container of noodles without much enthusiasm. "Furious at the truck driver. Furious at my father for the acquisition argument that distracted me in the first place. Furious at every doctor who talked about my new normal, like I should be grateful just to be alive and functional from the waist up. It took longer than I'd like to admit to understand that the chair didn't take anything from me that mattered. It just changed how I sat while I kept doing the same work." "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't started those undercover visits?" Owen asked. "If you just trusted the reports coming up from people like Voss?" "All the time." Her expression darkened slightly. "I think about how long it might have gone on. How many more people would have lost their jobs over something they didn't do? How much more medical equipment never made it to the hospitals that needed it?" She looked up at him. "I think about how I might never have stopped at that bus stop if I'd kept doing things the old way, surrounded by an entourage that would have handled the breakdown before I even noticed there was a problem." "Lucky bus stop, I guess." "Lucky everything," she said quietly, and reached across the table for his hand, and he gave it to her without hesitation, the gesture so familiar by now it barely registered as significant anymore, except in the way it still, every time, made something in his chest go warm and a little unsteady. They didn't rush anything, and Owen was grateful for that. Grateful that whatever was growing between them had room to breathe instead of getting forced into shape by the dramatic momentum of everything that had happened during the investigation. There were quiet dinners after Lily went to bed, video calls some nights when Evelyn was traveling for work, long stretches of ordinary conversation about nothing important that mattered more than either of them said out loud. There were also harder moments, the kind that came with building something real instead of something easy. An argument in March over a board decision Owen disagreed with, where Evelyn initially bristled at being challenged by someone she'd personally promoted, and it took both of them a few uncomfortable days to find their way back to honest footing. "I'm not going to just agree with you because you gave me this job," he told her after the dust had settled. "If I do that, I'm not actually any use to you. You hired me because I tell you the truth even when it's inconvenient. Don't get mad at me now for doing exactly that." She'd been quiet for a long moment, jaw tight, and then something had eased in her expression. "You're right. I'm sorry. I think some old habits about how people are supposed to talk to me die harder than I'd like. I'm not people. I'm Owen." "I know." A small, rueful smile. That's the whole problem and the whole point, I think. It was an imperfect kind of love story, the way real ones usually are, built less on grand gestures than on the slow accumulation of showing up, of choosing each other on ordinary Tuesdays when nothing dramatic demanded it, of learning each other's hard edges and deciding they were worth working around rather than walking away from. Lily, for her part, never seemed to question any of it, accepting Evelyn into the fabric of their small family with the easy, unguarded trust that children sometimes manage better than adults, asking one evening, with the bluntness only a 7-year-old could deploy, whether Evelyn was going to be her stepmom someday. Lily, Owen had started, caught off guard, but Evelyn had laughed, not embarrassed, just delighted by the directness of it. "Would that be okay with you if I were?" she'd asked, and Lily had considered the question with her usual seriousness before nodding decisively, like the matter was settled, and gone back to her coloring book without further comment, leaving both adults sitting at the table in a stunned, amused silence that neither of them quite knew how to follow up on. The proposal, when it came, wasn't particularly grand. Owen had thought about it for weeks, turning over elaborate plans and discarding most of them, until he realized the elaborate version wasn't really the point. He drove Evelyn out to the old bus stop on Route 9 on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, the same stretch of cracked concrete and overgrown weeds where he'd first pulled over more than a year earlier, except now the borough had finally cleared the lot during some unrelated road project, and the old plexiglass shelter had been removed entirely, leaving just the bench and the open sky. "Why are we here?" Evelyn asked as he helped her out of the car, genuine curiosity in her voice rather than suspicion. "I wanted to come back," he said simply. "I think about this spot a lot, about how close I came to just driving past you that day. I was tired. I was angry. I had every reason in the world to keep driving and not stop for anybody. But you stopped anyway. I stopped anyway." He crouched down in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his. "I think about that a lot, actually. How much of life comes down to whether you stop or whether you keep driving, whether you notice the person standing alone or whether you're too wrapped up in your own bad day to see them. I almost didn't stop, Evelyn, and if I hadn't, I don't think either of us would be who we are right now." Her eyes had gone bright, understanding arriving a half second before he finished the sentence. "Owen, I'm not good at the speeches you're probably used to from people in your world," he continued, voice rough now, the words coming less smoothly than he'd practiced them. "I don't have a ring that costs what your car costs. I've got a kid who adores you, a job I'm still not sure I deserve, and a stubborn belief that the two of us figured out something real in the middle of all that mess with Voss and Hale and everything else. I want to marry you, right here, if you'll have me, at the bus stop where none of this would have started if I hadn't stopped the car." "Ati wa suimerai." She was crying by the time he pulled the ring from his jacket pocket. Modest, nothing like the jewelry she could have afforded 1,000 times over, but chosen carefully, deliberately, with her actual preferences in mind, rather than some assumption about what a billionaire's engagement ring should look like. And she said yes before he'd even fully gotten the question out, pulling him into a kiss that tasted like salt and relief and something that had been building, quietly, for over a year. They married the following October, almost exactly 2 years after that first afternoon at the dead bus stop, and Evelyn insisted against the objections of nearly every event planner who pitched her on some elaborate downtown venue on holding the ceremony at the exact same spot. The borough had to grant a special permit, and Evelyn's team had spent weeks coordinating the logistics of turning an abandoned stretch of roadside into something that could hold 200 guests. But on the day itself, none of the effort showed. Just rows of simple white chairs arranged across the cleared lot, string lights threaded through temporary posts, and the same cracked concrete bench repainted now. Sitting at the edge of it all like a quiet witness to everything that had started there, Lily, 9 years old by then and fiercely proud of her role as flower girl, walked the makeshift aisle with a basket of white petals and an expression of total, serious concentration that broke into a wide grin the moment she spotted Owen waiting at the front. Mrs. Alvarez sat in the second row, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue she'd clearly brought prepared. Marcus and Priya sat together near the front, having become, somewhere along the way, genuine friends rather than just colleagues from the investigation. Even Renata Cruz had come, the woman whose mortgage Evelyn had personally expedited months earlier, sitting quietly near the back with an expression of grateful disbelief at finding herself invited to her CEO's wedding at all. Evelyn arrived in her wheelchair, dressed in a simple ivory gown that had been altered specifically to work with the chair rather than around it, her hair down for once instead of the severe braids and buns she usually favored for board meetings. And Owen felt something in his chest crack open at the sight of her moving down the aisle, composed and radiant and entirely herself. "You look," he started when she reached him, and then found he didn't have the words for it after all, just reached down and took her hand instead, letting the gesture say what his voice couldn't quite manage. The ceremony itself was short, simple, neither of them interested in elaborate vows that sounded better on paper than they'd feel in the moment. Owen spoke about the $40, about how little he'd had, and how much he'd somehow gained back tenfold in ways he never could have predicted that morning. Evelyn spoke about the version of herself who'd spent years keeping the world at arm's length after the accident, convinced that vulnerability and leadership couldn't coexist, and how one stranger's uncomplicated kindness had quietly proven her wrong. "I used to think strength meant never needing anyone," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, the autumn light turning gold behind her. "I built an entire identity around that idea after the accident, that asking for help, depending on someone, letting people see you when you're struggling, all of that was weakness I couldn't afford. Owen taught me something different without ever lecturing me about it, just by being exactly who he is. He taught me that the strongest thing a person can do is show up for someone who has nothing to offer them in return. That's not weakness. That might be the only kind of strength that actually matters." When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the small crowd erupted into applause that seemed to carry farther than 200 people should have been able to manage. And Owen kissed his wife at the exact spot where he'd once handed a stranger his last $40, without knowing it would become the most consequential decision of his life. The reception unfolded in a large tent erected just beyond the ceremony site, string lights and long tables, and a band that played late into the night, and somewhere in the middle of it, after the toasts and the first dance, and the cutting of a cake that Lily had insisted needed to have a marine biology theme woven in somehow, Owen found himself standing near the edge of the tent with Evelyn beside him, looking out at the old bus stop bench, now bearing a small bronze plaque the company's facilities team had installed at Evelyn's request earlier that week. Kindness stopped here. "You think anyone driving past is going to wonder what that means?" Owen asked, reading it again, even though he'd already seen it a dozen times since they'd arrived that morning. "Maybe. Maybe they'll just think it's strange. A plaque on a bench at a bus stop nobody uses anymore." Evelyn leaned against him slightly, her head resting on his arm. "But maybe somebody'll actually wonder, and maybe that's enough. Maybe somebody'll read it on a hard day and decide to stop for somebody else instead of driving past. That's all I really want it to do." Owen thought about that for a long moment, the band playing something slow behind them, Lily somewhere in the crowd dancing with Mrs. Alvarez. The whole improbable arc of the last 2 years collapsing into something he could finally hold steady in his mind. He thought about how close he'd come to not stopping that day, how exhausted he'd been, how broke, how easy it would have been to keep driving past a stranger who wasn't his problem, who had nothing to offer him, who he had no obligation to help. He thought about how the entire shape of his life, of Lily's life, of Evelyn's company and everyone it employed had pivoted on a decision that had taken him maybe 4 seconds to make. Slow down, pull over, ask if she was okay. No grand calculation, no expectation of return. Just a tired, broke, recently fired man choosing to be decent to a stranger because it was the right thing to do, and nothing more complicated than that. That was the part he kept coming back to, in the months and years that followed, whenever someone asked him how all of it had happened, how a warehouse worker had ended up married to the CEO of a global logistics company, how a falsely accused man had ended up at the center of an investigation that had reshaped an entire corporation's culture. People wanted a more dramatic answer than the one he actually had. They wanted strategy, or luck, or some hidden master plan. The truth was smaller than that, and somehow bigger too. He'd had $40 and a stranger who needed help, and he hadn't overthought it. Victor Hale was released 18 months into his sentence on good behavior, and Owen heard through Marcus, who still kept loose tabs on the case out of old habit, that he'd moved out of state, taken a quiet job somewhere far from logistics or warehouses, trying to rebuild something out of the wreckage of his own choices. Owen felt no particular satisfaction in that, and no particular anger either, just a kind of distant, settled understanding that everyone in this story had made their choices and lived with the consequences, himself included. Daniel Voss remained in federal custody, his appeals exhausted by the time Owen and Evelyn's daughter was born 2 years after the wedding, a girl they named Hannah, who arrived with Lily's same stubborn chin and a quiet intensity in her dark eyes that reminded Owen, every time he looked at her, of the woman he'd married. Lily, 12 by then, took to her role as older sister with the same fierce seriousness she brought to everything, reading marine biology facts to her infant sister with the conviction that information absorbed early would stick better than information absorbed late. The company itself had changed in ways that went beyond the org chart, beyond the compliance structures and the anonymous reporting lines, though those mattered too. Owen sat in on hiring committees now, where candidates were asked, explicitly, how they'd handled a moment of ethical pressure in a previous role, not as a gotcha question, but as a genuine attempt to understand the character of the people the company was bringing in. Evelyn instituted a policy, against significant pushback from some board members who thought it set a costly precedent, that any employee who reported genuine wrongdoing and faced retaliation for it would receive direct legal support from the company itself. No questions asked about whether the report had been convenient for leadership. "It costs us something, doing it that way," she told Owen one evening, the two of them on the back porch of the house they'd bought together, watching Lily teach Hannah, barely a year old and mostly just gumming on a plastic toy, the names of various ocean creatures with theatrical enthusiasm. "It's not the cheapest way to run a company, but I think it's the only way I can run one and still feel like the woman who stopped to thank a stranger at a diner instead of the woman who let Voss run things into the ground for 2 years without noticing." "You noticed eventually," Owen said. "That's what matters. Not everybody does." "I noticed because of you. Don't rewrite that part out of the story." He laughed, low and easy, the particular comfort of a marriage built on something real rather than something performed for an audience. Out past the porch railing, the evening had gone soft and orange, the last of the daylight catching on Hannah's dark hair as she reached for the toy octopus Lily was holding just out of her grasp, both girls laughing at some private joke that belonged entirely to the world of children, untouched by anything that had happened before either of them existed. Owen thought, sometimes, about the version of his life that might have existed if he'd never been falsely accused, if Victor Hale had picked a different name to put on that termination file, if the universe had simply let him keep his warehouse job and never sent him driving past that bus stop on the worst morning of his year. He might have spent years more working a job that underpaid him, never knowing the full extent of what was being stolen around him, never meeting the woman who would become his wife, never watching his daughter grow up with a sister who adored her, never standing in a boardroom helping decide policies that protected thousands of workers from ever experiencing what he'd experienced. It was a strange kind of grace, he thought, the way the worst morning of his life had turned out to be the hinge on which everything good that followed had swung open. He didn't believe the universe planned it that way, didn't believe in some grand design that had orchestrated his firing specifically so he'd be driving past that particular bus stop at that particular hour. He believed something simpler and somehow more demanding than that kindness, offered without calculation, without any guarantee of return, had a way of finding its way back around eventually. Not because some cosmic ledger balanced itself, but because decent people recognized decency in each other and built something out of that recognition. He thought about all the people who'd never get a story like his, the ones who stopped for a stranger and got nothing back, who gave their last $40 away and never saw a single dollar of it return, who showed up for someone in need and watched that person disappear without a word of thanks. Those acts mattered too, he believed, even without the dramatic payoff, even without a billionaire CEO on the other end of the kindness. The point was never the return. The point was the stopping. That was the lesson he found himself returning to, years later, when he talked to Lily and eventually Hannah about the story of how their family had come together. Not the corporate intrigue, not the wire he'd worn into those woods, not even the wedding at the bus stop, though all of that made for a better story when the girls wanted the exciting version. The real lesson, the one he hoped actually stuck, was smaller and quieter than any of that. You don't know, when you stop your car for a stranger, what it's going to cost you or what it might give back. You just know, in that moment, what the right thing is, and you do it anyway, because the alternative, driving past, looking away, deciding someone else's hardship isn't your problem, costs something too, something less visible, but no less real. The bus stop on Route 9 still stood there, years later, the bronze plaque weathering slightly with each passing season, but the words still legible, still meaning exactly what they'd meant the day Evelyn had it installed. Owen drove past it sometimes, on his own now, running errands or heading out to one of the company's regional facilities, and he always slowed down a little when he passed, not out of any particular ritual, just a kind of quiet acknowledgement, a nod to the version of himself who'd had $42 and a hole worn through his daughter's sneaker and had still, somehow, found it in himself to stop the car. He'd built a life since then that he never could have imagined on that gray morning when Pete, the security guard, walked him out through the loading dock. A wife who'd taught him that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites. 2 daughters who were growing up believing that doing the right thing actually mattered. A job that let him protect people the way nobody had protected him during those 6 years on the warehouse floor. None of it had come easily, and none of it had come without cost. The fear in that clearing, the months of careful, exhausting investigation, the weight of watching people he'd worked alongside get led away in handcuffs even when they deserved it. But all of it had started with a decision that cost him almost nothing in the moment and meant everything in the end. Slow down, pull over, ask if she's okay. That was the whole story, really, however many headlines and courtroom proceedings and corporate restructurings had grown up around it since. A tired man, a stranded woman, and the simple, unremarkable, world-altering choice to stop the car instead of driving past.